Imagine arriving at a busy border crossing, hopeful and exhausted, only to be turned away without a chance to tell your story. Picture cities across the United States where federal agents are no longer a rare sight, but a daily presence in schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Imagine millions of families debating whether to leave the place they've called home for years because the rules just changed. Again. That's the United States in the year after a sweeping immigration crackdown under President Donald Trump. What actually changed? Did the policies make the border more secure? Did they shift immigration patterns? And what kind of impact have they had on communities, courts, the economy, and everyday Americans? Let's unpack all of that in a way that's informative, approachable, and grounded in the facts. To understand what changed, we first have to go back and take a look at what Trump's immigration crackdown really involved. This was not a single policy or one dramatic moment. It was a series of aggressive changes to long-standing immigration rules, enforcement priorities, and the way the U.S. treats people seeking to cross its borders or live within its borders without documented status. It included a dramatic expansion of border security measures, from building new physical barriers to deploying federal agents and the military to ports of entry, as well as renewed travel bans that limited who could enter the United States from certain countries. It also involved policies that separated families at the border, although the specifics of those policies evolved over time and were met with legal challenges and public outrage. These efforts weren't just about stopping people at the border. They extended deep into U.S. cities through raids and interior enforcement, tapping local law enforcement and even non-traditional partners in the effort to find, detain, and deport individuals suspected of violating immigration laws. In broad strokes, what this crackdown signaled was a shift from managing immigration flows to trying to sharply reduce them, not just in terms of irregular border crossings, but also legal immigration and asylum. The administration significantly cut back refugee admissions, suspended or tightened asylum procedures, and even paused immigrant visa processing for dozens of countries, citing various security and administrative concerns. As of early 2026, these combined actions had contributed to a net negative flow of immigrants, meaning more people were leaving the United States than arriving for the first time in more than 50 years. Now let's talk about how these policies changed immigration patterns themselves. One of the clearest early indicators was at the U.S.-Mexico border. In the months after Trump took office for his second term, border encounters dropped sharply, with reports of a 39% decline in illegal border arrests in January compared to the previous month, one of the lowest levels in recent history. These downward trends continued throughout the year, with annual apprehensions falling to levels not seen in decades. What explains those dramatic numbers? Part of it is simply deterrence. When the U.S. government signals that crossings will be met with immediate removal and little chance to seek asylum, many potential migrants choose not to make the journey. But migration isn't driven by one thing alone. Violence, economic insecurity, climate change, and family reunification all play major roles. Even so, tougher asylum rules and the suspension of humanitarian pathways reduce the incentives for people to come or to remain in the queue waiting to be processed. According to data from the Department of Homeland Security, border crossings and asylum attempts hit historic lows following the policy changes. There was also a noticeable shift in where enforcement was happening. Early in the crackdown, the focus was on the border itself, catching people as they tried to cross. But as time went on, enforcement efforts spread inland, using data sharing between federal, state, and local agencies to expand immigration operations inside U.S. communities. This meant that rather than only apprehending people at the border, authorities increasingly targeted individuals living and working in cities and towns across the country. These interior operations included workplace raids, arrests at homes and public places, and collaborations with local law enforcement that many immigrant advocates and civil liberties groups found deeply troubling. So how have communities been affected by these changes? The impact has been both profound and deeply personal. In immigrant communities, especially in states with large populations of undocumented residents like California, Texas, and Florida, the fear of detention and deportation rose dramatically. People reported avoiding routine activities, dropping children off at school, going to doctor's appointments, or applying for jobs, out of fear that any contact with authorities could lead to arrest. This fear isn't just anecdotal. Legal and advocacy organizations documented widespread anxiety among families whose daily lives were disrupted by enforcement campaigns. Families have been torn apart. Reports from multiple sources showed that federal immigration agents detained thousands of minors, including very young children, during operations in 2025. Some of these children were U.S. citizens. Some had pending asylum claims or long-standing ties in the country. These detentions drew national attention and sparked protests and lawsuits, as critics argued that such practices violated protections long recognized in U.S. law, including that no child should be held in immigration detention in unsafe or inhumane conditions. At the same time, immigrant advocates pointed out that many people without criminal records were also swept up in enforcement actions, contradicting official claims that the crackdown focused primarily on individuals with serious criminal histories. Newly released data showed that a significant portion of interior arrests targeted individuals with no criminal convictions, raising serious questions about the fairness and focus of the enforcement strategy. These policies also triggered significant legal battles. From day one, various elements of the Trump crackdown, including asylum suspensions, restrictions on legal pathways, and the reduction of refugee admissions, were met with lawsuits alleging constitutional violations, breaches of international law, and unlawful executive overreach. Federal courts across the country blocked certain actions, delayed implementation, or required the government to provide due process protections for people in detention. For example, efforts to reinterpret or eliminate birthright citizenship under the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment were challenged and struck down by judges who ruled that such changes would require legislation, not executive fiat. State and city governments also entered the fray. Several sanctuary municipalities sued to protect their residents from broad enforcement actions, arguing that federal policies unlawfully interfered with local governance and public safety. In some cases, courts imposed limits on how far federal agencies could go in using local resources or detaining people without clear warrants. These legal battles underscored the tension between federal immigration enforcement powers and civil liberties protections that have deep roots in American law. Public reactions to the crackdown were deeply polarized, reflecting broader divides in the national discussion about immigration. On one side were supporters who applauded the tougher stance, crediting the administration with restoring law and order at the border and discouraging unlawful immigration. Polls showed that a significant segment of Republican voters continued to support strict enforcement measures and increased border security spending. On the other side were critics from immigrant rights groups, civil liberties organizations, religious leaders, and many Democrats who decried the crackdown as not only inhumane but also economically counterproductive. Some local governments passed resolutions condemning federal actions, while grassroots movements organized protests, legal aid efforts, and community support networks to help families at risk of deportation. Interestingly, opinion data suggested that broader American views on immigration were shifting during this period. Some national surveys showed that a growing number of Americans saw immigration as more beneficial than problematic, and there was increased support for providing pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who had been living in the country for years. These trends seemed to cut across traditional party lines, indicating that the public conversation about immigration was becoming more complex, not less. The economic effects of the immigration crackdown were equally significant. Immigrant labor has long been a backbone of key U.S. industries, from agriculture and construction to hospitality and healthcare. With stricter enforcement and higher risk associated with undocumented work, many employers reported labor shortages, especially in sectors heavily reliant on immigrant workers. Some agricultural communities, for example, experienced sharp declines in workforce availability, leading to reduced crop outputs and higher prices for consumers. Economic modeling from academic sources estimated that enforcement raids could reduce the agricultural workforce by as much as 20 to 40% in certain regions, translating into billions of dollars in lost crops and supply chain disruptions. Businesses that depend on immigrant labor faced difficult decisions: invest in automation and risk losing their competitive edge, lobby for guest worker programs, or relocate operations altogether. The hospitality industry saw similar strain as employees left or avoided sectors with irregular work patterns and higher exposure to immigration enforcement. In cities with dense immigrant populations, Declines in consumer spending also had ripple effects on local economies, affecting small business revenue and municipal tax bases. It's important to note that the economic impact wasn't uniform across the board. Some sectors that benefited from reduced labor competition reported temporary wage gains or increased opportunities for certain native workers. However, these gains were often offset by higher costs for goods and services, slower growth in industries dependent on immigrant labor, and investment uncertainty stemming from policy unpredictability. Environmentally, medically, and socially, the reduction in immigration had nuanced consequences. University enrollments declined as international students and immigrant families reconsidered moving to the U.S., affecting research programs and campus diversity. In some rural areas, local hospitals faced staffing shortages as nurses and support staff, many of whom were immigrants, left or avoided relocating due to policy concerns. As we assess all these changes after 1 year of the Trump immigration crackdown, it's clear that we are not talking about a simple shift in policy, but a transformation of how the United States approaches human mobility and its own demographic future. Border enforcement statistics may show dramatic declines in crossings, but the story beneath those numbers reveals complex human consequences, legal challenges, and economic trade-offs that extend far beyond the border itself. There are also questions about long-term effects. Will fewer people choose to migrate to the United States in the coming years because of stricter rules? Will legal challenges continue to carve out protections that limit enforcement overreach? Can industries adapt to a smaller labor pool without jeopardizing growth and innovation? And perhaps most importantly, how will the values that define this country, including opportunity, fairness, and human dignity, be reflected in the immigration policies of the future? As we wrap up, here's a question for you, our viewers. What do you think is the most important priority for U.S. immigration policy going forward? Security and enforcement, humanitarian protections, economic growth, or something else entirely? Tell us in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives on U.S. immigration policy.